Okay, so last time we considered the 44 suttas where the Buddha gives the Dhamma in brief as a teaching to someone who's going on retreat. And we saw that the two main topics for meditation were the five aggregates and the six sense bases. And then the wisdom aspect was most often some version of the three characteristics. And that's a bunch of technical terminology, but we went over that last time. And even though that's all technical sounding, I gave some fairly mundane examples of how we could touch into these practices in our daily life, such as looking at the impermanence of taste or looking at the uncontrollability, which is part of not self, of sound. And I'm curious if anyone has any comments about trying any of those or anything that you may have noticed in daily life that somehow relates to the main topics of what the Buddha was teaching in the Dhamma in brief. Just wanted to make space for winding things up from last week. Great.
My emotional states change, thank God. And then they change back. And I keep thinking, this is going to change. And it does.
And is that helpful to
It,
be
it
aware of that?
definitely is, yes. It keeps me from getting excessively depressed and also
Yeah.
not
So
overly
that's
excited.
and not overly excited either. Yeah, that's great. That is a perfect everyday example. And as you know, emotional states are part of Sankhara, the fourth of the five aggregates. So you're right in there with one of the teachings that the Buddha was offering. And yeah, I do want to highlight that seeing that things change helps us kind of mitigates the highs and the lows, right? And we'll actually see a reference today also to someone understanding the nature of change. It was a deep teaching given by the Buddha, even though it's also um, fairly everyday. So thanks, Wayne. Yeah. Okay. So in the suttas when we looked at them, the Dhamma in brief is a form of teaching that's given to a monastic, and probably related to the fact that it's about going off on retreat, and that wasn't something that lay people really did at the time of the Buddha. They didn't have the space in their life, so we live in a very special and interesting time where lay people can actually do that. There's an interesting history to lay people learning how to go on retreat, but that's not the subject of this class, so don't get me on it. But it's fairly recent, actually, and we are the beneficiaries of that. Um, so we also saw that from the Dhamma in brief, this person going on retreat may or may not attain full awakening from it. It seems to depend mostly on the person. But the Dhamma in brief is a deep Dharma teaching that's aimed at being able to awaken the mind completely. And it kind of encapsulates the full depth of the Buddha's teaching into this one summary, if you will, that he gives to these people. And as far as we can tell, that is in the cases where we actually know who the person was that he gave it to, these people were pretty far along in their practice. He gave it to people who were dedicated practitioners, even among monastics. They had a lot of experience. So what about us? For lay people, um, there's a form of teaching that's called the graduated discourse. I mentioned this at the end of the last class. It's also called the progressive discourse or the step-by-step discourse. It all depends how you translate the word anupubha, which means something like following in turn, successive, or gradual. Um, and just as I mentioned this before, but this is not the same as the gradual training, which is in itself kind of an encapsulated teaching that's talked about in many suttas, and it goes through what happens to a person from when they embark on the path through all the different things they would have to train in order to awaken. So this is a different idea. This is one single discourse. It's a single Dharma talk that's delivered to a layperson that takes them through a standard set of topics that we're going to look at today, and which leads to stream entry in Pali Suttas. And stream entry is the first of the stages of awakening, so it's not full awakening. That's the fourth. So it seems, though, that the Buddha gave this special talk to someone whom he knew was ready to have some kind of a deep Dharmic insight. He saw that their mind was kind of ready for it. So it's not that the discourse itself is guaranteed to have some kind of powerful effect by its own nature, but instead it's the intuition of the Buddha that the person was ready. So just want to make that clear. Although we will go through the topics today, and if you listen carefully, you never know, right? So it could have been different. The implication then is that the graduated discourse could have been different each time in length or style. All we know is the list of topics, and we don't know how the Buddha went through them or how long it took. So I'll get to that list in a moment. The implication, I think, from reading the text that I've read that include it, is that it wasn't super long either. I mean, he usually gives it to a layperson who's kind of standing there or sitting there with him, sometimes even with other people present. And so it's the implication is probably not like a 3 or 4 hour long lecture with diagrams and charts and sorts of things. It's kind of something that he goes through and highlights various topics in the person's mind and leads them along a path. So it's an interesting concept, right? As we're talking about this sudden versus gradual. And here we have a case where a person has a significant change from hearing one discourse. So we'll talk about context a little bit more as it goes along. But let's get into it a little bit. There are 3 general parts to these graduated discourse teachings. There are the preliminary conditions, there's the topics of the talk, and there's the result in the layperson. And as far as I know, this talk was given in 9 suttas, and we'll talk later about who the recipients were. But for now, let's say a little bit about each of these parts. So the preliminary conditions. So these always include some kind of expression or indication of deep confidence in the Buddha from the layperson. So this is always described in some way in the text that precedes when the Buddha starts giving this discourse. And it varies a bit from sutta to sutta. So it's not like there's a formula just for this part. But there are, I can name a few of the various ways. A common one is that the person declares that they are going for refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. You may have said the refuges if you've been on retreat. In our tradition, we often say the 3 refuges at the beginning of the retreat as part of the setting the container. It's where you say, I go for refuge in the Buddha, in the Dharma, and the Sangha for a second time, for a third time. You may have done that in Pali or heard it. So people actually do that in the teachings. They don't use exactly that formulaic language they don't use exactly the same language that we use at the beginning of retreats. But they use a stock phrase that's very similar to that, just a little bit more elaborate. I think I'll read it later. And then also there are some cases where the person sees, it's hard to describe this to a modern audience, but the people were Brahmins who were looking for what are called the 32 marks of a great man, which are like the 32 marks that are supposed to show that somebody is enlightened according to their tradition. And the Buddha apparently had these marks, and so they would come and they were looking for the marks. And there comes a point, when they're interacting with the Buddha, that they realize that he has all 32 marks. And so then that's their understanding of it. Then they have confidence in him because that's what their tradition says is useful. So that happens in a couple cases. And then there's a couple cases of several cases of what we could call instant devotion, where somebody says, upon seeing the Buddha, my heart acquired confidence. And, there's the idea that the Buddha had a very special kind of bearing, somebody who was enlightened, and people who were attuned to that could see that. And then there was also the case of a kind of an exceptional case, one of them, where a person who was very marginal in society, he was a leper, he saw a big gathering of people and he thought maybe there's going to be food given out there. And so he went, and it turned out not to be food, but to be a Dharma talk. And so nominally, his reason for being there ended, but he got intrigued and he saw that people were listening and he said, I think I can listen to the Dharma also. And so he kind of sits down and you can see that he's kind of drawn to what's going on. And he ends up being a recipient of this discourse. So we'll talk more about this quality of confidence or faith later because it's actually very rich and not very well understood necessarily. We tend to have a different idea about it in our own culture. But it's very important. It's clear when you read these suttas, it's common to all of them, is that the person slowly or quickly develops some kind of confidence such that their mind is open and receptive and has faith in that moment. So then, seeing this and realizing that not only they had faith, because a lot of people came with faith, but they not only had faith, but they had the conditions in their mind for being able to receive the Dharma at that moment. The Buddha realizes this. The text says, then the Blessed One gave the household, I'll use an actual name from one of the suttas, so it's actual words of the sutta. Then the Blessed One gave the householder Upali progressive instruction, that is, talk on giving, talk on virtue, talk on the heavens. He explained the danger, degradation, and defilement in sensual pleasures and the blessing of renunciation. When he knew that the householder Upali's mind was ready, receptive, free from hindrances, elated, and confident, he expounded to him the teaching special to the Buddhas, dukkha, its origin, its cessation, and the path. So there you go. That's the discourse. It starts with Dhamma, and it ends with the Four Noble Truths. And so that's fairly indicative of other patterns you may have seen in the suttas, where Dhamma is almost always the foundational quality that we need to have. And then the Four Noble Truths somehow encapsulate and point toward awakening in a way that was considered unique to the Buddha. Some of you know that the Turning of the Wheel discourse is about the Four Noble Truths, where the Buddha first expounds those. And so that was considered his first discourse. And so this was when he, established his, modern language, established his brand. That's a terrible thing to say, isn't it? But he, that was his thing. And so here it's labeled as the teaching special to the Buddhas. So I want to go through these topics and kind of frame them in a progressive way. Why do these form a progression? And this is now my interpretation, because we're never told I just read the text of what it says. It doesn't say how the Buddha talked about each of these things, how he strung them together. Maybe that would have been clearer to somebody in that culture. Maybe there's some obvious link between all of these, but I don't think so. I think it was a unique talk that he gave, and we can interpret it based on knowing his teachings in general. So he starts with giving, dana, and that is really considered the foundational quality for a follower of the Buddha. So literal giving in the sense of supporting teachers, sanghas, monasteries. This is built right into the structure of the teachings, where the monastics are dependent upon the lay people for their livelihood. Monastics in the Theravadan Buddhist tradition can't cook, store food, or grow it. So you don't eat unless somebody gives you food, and it has to be every day because you can't store it. So it was built in that the monastics were dependent on lay people. And this was wise. Then they couldn't be kind of elite and off by themselves. They had to be in association with people who were living in the world. So that's the kind of the foundational understanding is that there's this mutual dependence between the monastics and the lay people, and that's the foundation of Dhamma. So everyone would have understood that. Everyone who was interested in the Buddhist teachings would have understood that. But a little bit more subtly, we have giving. We're going to see renunciation coming up, giving or letting go as an ongoing thing that we do all along the path. Maybe there's literal giving, and but there's also then giving up of the hindrances, sitting in meditation, being willing to train the mind. What do we have to give up in order to practice the path? And eventually, letting go of deep views that we carry about how things work, understandings about ourselves, understandings about so many things that end up being insights on the path, right? Those are all letting go of various kinds. So I think it's not just accidental that giving is first, and it's not just literal, like Buddha is trying to get more donations or something. It's a quality of mind and heart that's going to serve all along the path. Then he talks about virtue, sila, also very commonly near the beginning of lists, dana, sila. And in this case, he means that the mind has to be well directed. So at the most basic form for lay people, virtue is keeping of the 5 foundational precepts, which are common to many spiritual traditions and religions the world over. The first 4 of them, I think, being common, to nearly all of them: not killing, not stealing, not sexual misconduct, and not lying. Those are quite basic. And then the 5th for lay people in this tradition is non-intoxication, mind and body. And so this is also foundational. People tend to frame it as I'm supposed to be a good person. Sometimes in the West, we get confused with other religious ideas that talk about what will happen to you after you die based on your behavior here. And that's, true in the realm of rebirth also, but in a more immediately practical sense, virtue is the basis for sound meditation. You can't really easily get the mind settled and concentrated and directed toward insight if there's a lot of churning around in the system because we haven't been behaving in line with wholesome qualities. So, whatever your motivation is for wholesome qualities, the Buddha had a very practical reason for pointing in that direction. And also remember, he's giving a talk to somebody who has faith, and he's trying to lead them along toward being able to have an insight. And so we see we see here that having wholesome qualities of mind is going to be very supportive for the mind to be able to awaken, to have insight. So talk on virtue, and also virtue feels good, right? For if you have a theoretical idea of it, sometimes people think, oh, virtue, ethics. It reminds me of times in the past where this was put on me as an obligation or something. But when we actually touch into the experience of wholesomeness, it feels so good, to know that we've acted in line with these virtuous qualities. So this person is also, starting to feel really good through through this talk being given to them. And then we have talk on the heavens. Where did that come from? So this is about the Deva realms. And in this case, I think what's being pointed to is, not so much sort of a belief or an idea that there's what's going to happen to this person after they die or something like that. In the Buddhist cosmology, the Deva realms are occupied by beings who have cultivated a lot of good qualities in their life. And you can be reborn in heaven by being a good person and also by cultivating concentration and other meditative qualities. And the heavens are a lot better than the human realm in terms of how they feel. You don't have such bodily pain. You exist for a very long time. The mind is things are generally tranquil, easier to be with. So it's something that would have been appealing. It's appealing enough for us here. It would have been very appealing to somebody in Iron Age India. It was this notion of living in the heaven realms, being reborn as a deva, or yeah. And here he's reminding people essentially that they're part of a much bigger cosmological picture. We tend to get ourselves focused in on our little world, our problems, what we're going to do today, what we need to do by tomorrow, all the little day-to-day things that we have to occupy ourselves with. He's painting a bigger picture of there being a whole cosmos, and there's a lot of potential through goodness and virtue to experience much better living conditions and better life conditions. And even in this life, we can start to partake of some of those. So the person feels even more inspired. Oh, the heavens, yeah, the bigger picture, these wonderful, amazing realms that are possible and are part of the universe. And then we get to the fourth topic. He explained the danger, degradation, and defilement in sensual pleasures. Yeah, right. This is classic Buddhism, right? Then we get to the downer part about the sense pleasures that sometimes overly characterizes us, let me say. But essentially, I can see this following on from the prior ones in that if we're wrapped up in sensual pleasures of various kinds, we're not really able to access these higher states of mind. We know that the first of the 5 hindrances that prevent wisdom and concentration on the cushion is sensual desire, which means sitting there on the cushion and fantasizing about what you're going to have for lunch after this meditation is over, or imagining your trip to Hawaii and why that would be more interesting than having to sit here for half an hour being quiet, these kinds of things. And, even if we're not overly focused on sense pleasures in our life, I think all of us have had sits where it was really thinking about, something that is essentially what I'm going to get, what I'm going to get sometime in the future, or what I had in the past. Wasn't it great when I was, hanging out with my friends last weekend at that restaurant? Oh, that was such a good dish we had. Maybe I could cook that. Did I ever get that recipe online? I was going to look it up, you know. So the mind is kind of wandering around in that territory. And so the Buddha reminds the person, this is a limited way of living compared to dana, sila, the potential for these higher mind states. And so the person realizes, oh yeah, okay, so it's true, these don't really go anywhere. And you see people with more of these or fewer of these, but everybody seems unhappy. And the process of pursuing them takes a lot of energy and effort, right? So then he goes on to the blessing. That word could also be translated as benefit or advantage of renunciation. And here, the word renunciation is always problematic. That's the standard one, so I said it. But and I think we should revive this word a little bit and have a different understanding of it than it's gotten in Western society, let's say. But the renunciation is offered as the escape from being enslaved to our senses, to our smaller drives, internal drives that we have for food and sex and things like that. And so renunciation is the wisdom to say, to choose how to do those things wisely. I mean, obviously, we're still going to eat and relate people. We're going to reproduce, and it's fine to have a vacation, and it's all those things. But renunciation includes the wisdom of being able to say when it's the right time for each of those things. Sometimes renunciation is associated with leaving the household life and ordaining as a monastic. That's another meaning of the term, but I don't think that's what's meant in this graduated discourse, because it's given to a layperson. And in general, they don't ordain afterward. There's one case where they do, but it's a special case. It wasn't the Buddha Gautama that induced the person to ordain. It's a story about a prior Buddha, the Buddha Vipassi. There were other Buddhas. And so I'm going to take that one as an exception and say that for the Buddha Gautama, nobody who got this discourse ended up ordaining. So that's not what renunciation means here. It just means that this is an alternative. Having enough wisdom to be able to say yes, to say no to the kind of more animal side is a benefit. And generally, the blessing of renunciation is meant to have two sides to it. One is that you get the blessing of not being enslaved to the sensual pleasures. You get the blessing of whatever challenges were coming because of that, whatever difficulties with expending your energy and so forth, all those are gone. And you also gain then a bunch of space in your life to have more good things come in. The classic example I give is that if the deepest, maybe one of the deepest forms of sense pleasure addiction we have is literal addiction to alcohol or drugs in our society, fairly well known. And the blessing of not doing that is twofold. One is that you're no longer being damaged by the alcohol, literally. And the other is that you suddenly have more money, more time, more ability to work, better friends, new good things come into your life through giving up that addiction. So somehow the Buddha conveys all of those ideas in this first part. And then the person is poised. And the text says, when he knew that this householder's mind was ready, receptive, free from hindrances, elated, and confident. So there's 5 qualities that we could see as conditions. Remember, I always talk about conditionality in these transformations. These are the conditions that are there. And these are the conditions where the Buddha says, okay, now this person's ready for the 4 Noble Truths. And then he teaches them dukkha, its origin, its cessation, and the path. So there, I think he points maybe quite deeply to, he's not just talking anymore about sort of ordinary sense pleasures. He's talking about all kinds of stress and suffering and difficulty and unsatisfactoriness that there is in life. And not to say that life is those things, but that they exist. And when you really look at it, it is hard. It's hard to be a human. And people have a sense of it. If you've spent your life just trying to have the job and the house and the family and the dog and, trying to keep all that stuff going, there comes a point where you realize this is kind of tiring. And what is all this for? Like, what am I aiming for in all of this? So the Buddha points out, there is an underlying drive in us that's kind of fueling all of this activity. And unless we see that drive can be released, there will be no end to the ongoing struggle, those things. But there is a way to end that push underneath, which is the craving origin, the craving to get more, do more, be different, anything, or not be anymore, to stop being. All those things are part of craving. And when we see the sort of the root underneath all of that frenetic activity that we do, it's possible to, he says, it's possible to release that. And the person gets a glimpse of, that would be great. And then he tells them there's a path to do that. And so during this, we have the person gets it, and they So now we move on to the result of this teaching, and I'll read again the text, and it's always the same. It says, just as a clean cloth with all marks removed would take dye evenly, so too, while the householder Upali sat there, the spotless, immaculate vision of the Dhamma arose in him. All that is subject to arising is subject to cessation. That's interesting in and of itself. We'll get back to that, but I'll just finish it off. Then the householder Upali saw the Dhamma, attained the Dhamma, understood the Dhamma, fathomed the Dhamma. He crossed beyond doubt, did away with perplexity, gained intrepidity, and became independent of others in the teacher's dispensation. Wow. So that's the stock phrases around this attainment of stream entry in the case of the graduated discourse. So the spotless, immaculate vision of the Dhamma also could be said dustless or stainless. I'm not sure I like the word immaculate. It has implications from other religions, sounds like. But this vision of the Dhamma, or sometimes eye of the Dhamma, it's said, the word is literally eye, but chaku, but vision, I think, is appropriate also. So they see something, and the insight is all that is subject to arising is subject to cessation. Or we could also say, based on the Pali, anything that is of the nature to arise is of the nature to cease. So that's interesting. The realization is impermanence. And we may not immediately perceive this conclusion as following logically from what came before, from this graduated discourse. And I'm going to say that that's explained because it's an insight. It's not a logical deduction. It's just not something that it was all explained in a certain way, and the person says, "Oh, I get it. Finally, I understand what a covalent bond is." Instead of before I only understood ionic bonds, but now you've explained it so clearly. It's not really like that. I just pulled that out of a hat. But it's more like an insight. So the person listens to this whole thing and their mind shifts in a certain way such that they have this understanding of impermanence. And but I would say it is in line with the flow of the graduated discourse, which points the person toward essentially higher potentials. First, the ordinary higher potentials that come from giving, from virtue, from letting go of all the sense pleasures and being wise about living in a restrained way, the potential for heaven, and then the potential for really letting go of the whole concept of what it is that we're doing in life. That is the little turn or the big turn that comes in the mind with stream entry, is to understand it's not actually about me. It's not actually about me. There isn't an eternal soul that we could call that, and there's a process going on that isn't about that. So it's a big change in understanding, in a sense. I think I don't want to go too much farther into that. Oh, and then maybe I'll add that typically after the person has this realization, they do something reverential, like offer a meal to the Buddha or something like that, or say some inspired verses. Sometimes people take refuge after the graduated discourse, by the way. They have some other act of faith beforehand, they get the discourse, and then they declare refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So, so there it is. That's the graduated discourse and how it unfolds, and the effect of the person wakes up, essentially. They're not fully awakened, but their life has been irrevocably changed by understanding what the Buddha was explaining about the Four Noble Truths. So maybe I'll pause there and just ask for questions at this point.
I'll just ask briefly,
Oh.
is it that sort of compacted, because it seems like, for example, the Buddha could say quite a bit about the danger, degradation, and defilement of sense pleasures to kind of like, really help the person get it, for example.
That's a good point. There are whole suttas where he lists long lists of disadvantages of engaging in the pursuit of sense pleasures. And like I said, I don't really know how long this discourse was. The implication doesn't seem to be that it was hours and hours long. So my guess is maybe he chose, this is now my interpretation, maybe he knew the person enough or could look into their mind and chose particular examples that would be meaningful for them. And yeah, and pointed them just through a couple of examples toward understanding that. Remember that their mind was very faithful and very poised toward wanting to hear this teaching. So yeah, I would guess that he summarized it in some compact way.
I'm just curious, like, would you mind naming like another one of those suttas where it's unpacked? Just like, I'd love to go read the kind of expanded version.
I think Majjhima Nikaya 13, I think, has quite a bit. And then there's also one, I don't remember the exact number, somewhere in the 60s that has quite a lot also.
Thank you.
Both of them are referenced in my book, actually. In Full Simplicity, there's a section on the dangers of sense pleasure, and both of those, 13 and whatever the one I couldn't remember, is talked about there. Yeah. Thanks. Good question.
Yeah, one question I had was, thank you first for all of this information. You mentioned sort of the preliminary conditions sort of being first, and then when it comes to the topics, did it seem like it was a preliminary condition for a person to understand one topic before the Buddha would continue on to the other topic? Was it sort of step by step in that way too?
It doesn't say that. It just says talk on giving, talk on virtue, etc. So maybe this is again speculation, maybe he was watching the person to see that they were understanding and then he would move on. The way if you were explaining to somebody how to do a long process, you might not necessarily ask, did you get that? Okay, let's go on to step 2, but you would explain step 1, and if they nod and look like they get it, you go on to the next one. That'd be my guess. It doesn't literally say that he had confirmation of each, understanding each thing. Well, maybe I thought I would say a little bit now about focusing on one of these stories, because last time we had the story of Malankya-Putta, who was one of the people receiving the Dhamma in brief, and so I thought we'd look at Upali in this case, just to add kind of a human face onto this. What is some of the context that comes up here? We'll do it fairly briefly. There were at least 2 Upalis in the suttas, by the way, and this one was a Brahmin layperson who was wealthy and well known in the community, and he was a prominent follower of a person named the Nikanta Nataputta, whose name was also Mahavira, and that's the leader of the Jains, or the Nikantas. So his name was Nataputta or Mahavira, and he was a Jain, and he was in fact the leader of them. And so this Brahmin Upali was a follower of him. And there was another follower of Nikanta Nataputta who had a debate with the Buddha, kind of a brief conversation with him about whether bodily, verbal, or mental action is the most powerful, especially in the case of unwholesome action, like which of these is the worst. And so the Jain person says it is, based on what his leader says, it's bodily action that's the worst. And we might agree with that on the surface, that it's probably worse to actually kill somebody than to imagine doing it. But But interestingly, in this particular debate, the Buddha asserts that mental action is actually the most consequential. And so the follower of Nikata Nataputta goes back to him and reports all of this. And he reports it to an assembly where Upali is also there with a bunch of other lay followers. And Upali says, and they all say, oh, that's ridiculous. And so Upali says, I'm going to go debate the Buddha on this. And the first guy who went and came back and reported this said, I don't think you should go because, the Buddha's really good in debate and he tends to have some kind of magical power to convert people. I don't think you should go. And Upali says, I want to go. And so anyway, in the end, Upali decides to go. And so he goes and he makes the same assertion. He says, the Jain leader says that bodily action is the most defiled, not mental action. And then the Buddha gives Upali a series of similes through which he makes the case that mental action actually is more powerful, either because it has to be there to precede bodily action, and hence is the real force behind it, or he also gives the example of how supernormal mental powers can do much more than limited bodily action can. There was a belief, and in that society, in the ability to affect, if you had a strong enough concentration and a tapping into supernormal mental powers, you could do things that the body couldn't do. And so he gives that simile also. And so at the end of several such similes, so Upali keeps saying, I don't believe it, or, I'm gonna still assert it to the body. So the Buddha gives him another one and then another one. And at the end of several of these, Upali backs off and says that actually he was convinced after the very first simile that the Buddha was right, but he kept up because he wanted to hear more. So remember, this is a Buddhist story. So then he takes refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And the Buddha says to him, oh, be careful. You should investigate more carefully before you change your alliance. You've just declared that you're taking refuge in me and you're a follower of the Jains. He says you should be careful because you're a prominent person and it will have public ramifications if you change this allegiance, because Upali is very well known. And Upali is delighted, actually, and he says, wow, other teachers would have been eager for the fame, and you instead ask me to be careful about changing my allegiance. I feel even more devoted to you. And he takes refuge a second time. And the Buddha says, well, okay, but just so you know, you should probably still give alms to the Jains if they come to your house. You've been supporting them before. You should not cut off that support, even if you change your allegiance. And this even further delights Upali, who says other spiritual teachers would say to only support them. And here you say, I'm supposed to still support the Jains, even though I've become your follower. So he feels even more devoted and he takes refuge a third time. And so that's a very strong expression in Buddhist understanding. Whenever you say something 3 times, that means you really mean it. And so then, with all of that, that's the setup. And then the Buddha gives the graduated discourse and Upali awakens, the first stage of awakening. So I said earlier that this is followed then by some kind of an expression of gratitude, like offering a meal, and that does happen, but rather hilariously, I don't know why, in this particular sutta, the first thing Upali says after waking up is, I'm very busy, I have to leave, I have a lot of things to attend to. And the Buddha says, okay, go at your convenience. And so Upali rushes off to do his important things as an important person, but then later he invites the Buddha to come for a meal and gives a kind of a long elegy about his conversion. So it's kind of a nice story, and there's this sense of all the steps of the graduated discourse and the framing around it being there. we're going to look in a little while, by the way, at all the 9 suttas that are. I'll have another little chart like I did for the 44, and we'll go through and see who some of the other people were. So maybe at this point we are ready for looking at this list of the 9 suttas where this discourse is given. And I've listed also who they were given to. I'm sorry, it looks like it might be a little hard to read. You'll get this handout in case that's a little small. And then so they do have the common feature that the person takes refuge, sometimes before and sometimes after. So I listed that also. But in this column with a lot of words in it, it also mentions how they acquired that initial confidence before they were given the teaching. That the Buddha then, decided that it was a good time to give them the graduated discourse. And I thought I'd point out a few things that I noticed through looking at this list and reading through the texts, which you'll be able to do once you get the handout. So a number of them were prominent people in their society, let's say. So Kuttadanta, Upali, Siha, Brahmayu, all of those were famous and wealthy people that would have been well known. And in most of those cases, and then in this one of where it says Ambata Sutta, it was Ambata's teacher, Pokarasati, who got the teaching. And he was also, I think, a pretty well-known Brahmin. So in all of those cases, essentially there was kind of a debate or a discussion, and the Buddha said something and talked with people and interacted with them such that confidence was gained in him. So we might call it kind of almost a cognitive kind of confidence or trust that the person gained. In a couple of cases, they were seeing the 32 marks, which was all I mentioned earlier, was something that was convincing to Brahmins and that the Buddha was enlightened. But generally, there's a sense that through what the Buddha says, people realize that his teaching has value and makes sense in a certain way. And then we get down to the 2 that are with Uga. I think they're supposed to be different people. I don't know why they both have the same name. Maybe they refer to the same person. Where it's more of an emotional thing. So essentially, he's the one who, when he saw the Buddha, it says that he instantly acquired confidence in the Buddha just by seeing him. And the second one says that he was carousing when he saw the Buddha and instantly gained confidence, and his drunkenness subsided in that moment. So this was convincing to them in terms of acquiring confidence. And then this one that's the great discourse on traces left behind, the Mahabodhana Sutta. That's the unusual one that's about a prior Buddha, the Buddha Vipassi, not the Buddha Gautama. And in that case, this teaching was actually the first one that he gave after his awakening. So that was how he started acquiring followers. Very different, for example, than the Turning of the Wheel Sutta, which was the Buddha Gautama's first discourse. So I thought that was kind of interesting that this graduated discourse was the first one given by a prior Buddha. So it's an important one. And then we also have this case about the leper that I mentioned earlier, whose name was Supa Buddha. And there's a story, this is from the Udana, which is a somewhat different kind of text. And there's a story about his past and future lives that explain why he was receptive to Dharma. So you'll be able to look at that later. So we have the sense that the initial confidence was sometimes cognitive, sometimes emotional. And then there are these expressions of going for refuge, either done before or after, which is kind of both about the Buddha's teaching making sense to someone and it feeling emotionally right. I said I would read the standard phrase. Realize to get it from the book here. So, okay. Magnificent Venerable Sir, magnificent Venerable Sir, the Blessed One has made the Dhamma clear in many ways, as though he were turning upright what had been overthrown, revealing what was hidden, showing the way to one who was lost, or holding up a lamp in the dark for those with eyesight to see forms. Venerable Sir, I go to the Blessed One for refuge, and to the Dhamma and to the Sangha. Let the Blessed One remember me as a lay follower who has gone to him for refuge for life. So that's the classic phrase, similar to what we say at the beginning of a retreat, but a little bit more flowery, with the part about making the Dhamma clear, turning upright what had been turned over, etc. So all of that is kind of like saying, I mean, it's clearly an emotional expression, but it praises the way the Buddha explained things, such that they made sense, such that they were clear. So I like to say this is about the whole of the citta, the heart-mind. The heart and the mind are delighted by what the Buddha says in some way. So you're hearing a lot about this refuge, faith, confidence, trust. I think I've said that many, many times this evening. And that is the primary condition for this discourse being effective. Apparently, this is the quality that the Buddha considered very important in lay people to be receptive to the Dharma. Monastics is not as emphasized because they ordained. That's their expression of faith and confidence, is to live that lifestyle. So there's that. I think next time maybe we'll say a little bit more also about this quality of faith and confidence, because there's kind of more to say about that. I don't know if we'll have time tonight. So there's this initial one, and then in the middle of the discourse, just want to remind us that there was the part where the Buddha does check. We had the question earlier, does he check after every step? I don't think so, but not explicitly. But in the middle of the discourse, it says, when the Buddha knew that this person's mind was ready, receptive, free from hindrances, elated and confident, then he goes on with the rest. So there's kind of this explicit understanding that these particular qualities need to arise as we're listening to the Dharma in order for the mind to be ready to go through some kind of a transformation. So we also see, just as a little aside, for those of you who really like to look up suttas, in Majjhima Nikaya 4, the Buddha talks in his own case, before his awakening, about bringing to mind certain wholesome qualities that he had in order to be able to go and practice well. So even in his own case, he checked his own mind for wholesome qualities, and he paid attention to them, and he sort of honored them in himself. I think this has to be emphasized for Westerners because we don't like to reflect on our own good qualities. We've been told that that's not a nice thing to do, etc., etc. So, or it's too arrogant, but it's a key part of these teachings, is that we understand ourselves to have these good qualities. And in this case, ready, receptive, free from hindrances, elated, and confident. We're supposed to be happy. If you sit there on the cushion, grumbling and, wondering when the bell is going to ring and being depressed and all these things, that does happen. Anything can come up. But when the mind is elated is when it's getting close to having some kind of an insight. So I think this is worth reflecting on. Maybe this is, I want to offer some kind of reflections that we might consider for ourselves. how do you nourish your sense of confidence and your sense of sincerity in the practice? Do you explicitly think about that and nourish it in some way? Do you appreciate your own good qualities when they're present? And do you know how to deliberately bring them up as a support for practice? I had a teacher tell me once, Kim, it's important that you know how to cheer yourself up. And I've taken that advice from time to time. There are times when the mind just needs to be cheered up, and there's nothing fake, fakey positive about that. The mind's just wandering around in territory that's not very cheery, and it would do well to cheer itself up. And then this particular set about ready, receptive, free from hindrances, elated, and confident. Have you ever had times when your mind felt like that? Maybe on retreat, for example. We're not always in an everyday state like that. And if so, were they easy to recognize? These are all kind of reflective questions, but now I do have an actual question to ask, and I'd be curious if anyone wanted to answer. And there isn't just one answer. What practices do you think might lead to that set of qualities?
Metta?
Metta? Possibly, yeah. Yeah. I think so the Brahma Vihara practices could get the mind in a good state. Say that Anapanasati practice can do this also, mindfulness of breathing. And the Satipatthana Sutta says quite clearly that if a person were to practice that for a certain, 1 day, 7 days, etc., the mind will be able to realize the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths are, you may remember, the very last of the fourth Satipatthana, we contemplate the Four Noble Truths. So I think Satipatthana practice could also put the mind in such a state. These are very classical practices. And then maybe another question to consider is, do you think we can willfully create these, or do they come about as a result of some other kind of effort? Could you just sit down and say, okay, I'm going to now create ready, receptive, free from hindrances, elated, and confident?
I just was gonna say ritual and lighting candles, incense, chanting, all of those things can be very helpful.
And yeah, it's interesting that the people are pointing toward heart practices and devotional practices as bringing these up. It's possible. Those may not make the mind totally free from hindrances. We can still be carrying some various kinds of desire when doing those. The Brahma Viharas should be pretty good. But there is certainly a sense that the mind is in a very open and receptive, as it says, state. But this comes about, in my experience, quite naturally from the classical practices that the Buddha offers, even in breathing and other kinds of things. See for yourself. These are just my suggestions. Okay, so I gave you a little bit of a leading question before. Do you think we can willfully create these, or do they come about as results of other things? I think they're not so easy to create willfully. So that's maybe worth reflection also, because often we have a feeling like it's up to me, I got to do this, I'm sitting down in order to create certain things. And there's a certain value to having a sense of agency and confidence in sitting down and knowing what you're doing and tuning into renunciation of unhelpful mind states and so forth. But in the end, to really transform the mind, it's not really up to us. There's something else that comes in some way. I have a few more things to say, but I'll pause again for any questions or comments. We're just going to wind up after this. So, yeah, Carrie.
So, but we could just take one of them, like confidence. Like, yeah, we're not gonna be able to sit down and like go through the list and go, now I'll have this, now I'll have that. But we can be practicing to, build more access to all of those things at different points in our practice. Just like, okay, I'm gonna sit down, I'm gonna think about all the ways practice has benefited me, or, just to sort of build some confidence.
Absolutely.
We can have practices that are helping us sort of build up some of these things so they're more likely to show up when we're
Yeah.
doing these.
I think that's the happy medium of it's not exactly something that we can create, but we can put the conditions in place for it. Yeah, nicely said. And if we direct ourselves that way, we can expect that result. It's not random how these things come about. Yeah, so then maybe this gives us a sense of more like what we should be pointing toward or putting conditions in place for, these kinds of qualities that will poise the mind to let go in some way. Okay, so stepping back, we can see now that this form of teaching is quite different, actually, from the one that we looked at last week. So, although this is a literal brief teaching on the Dhamma, it's, as I said, it's a single discourse. It's not at all actually a condensed form of practice instructions as the other ones were, right? It's a very different idea. It's intended more as something that takes a person out of their usual way of seeing things. So they're buoyed up by confidence when they arrive, and then the person kind of follows the Buddha along a mental trajectory of toward getting a whole different understanding of what they're doing in their life. And this shift at stream entry is when a person acquires what is called right view or right understanding. I don't know if those words are very sufficient, though, because it's not something logical. It's not just a better view that could be explained. You used to think of it this way, and now it's this way. It's not quite like that. It's actually, it's not something that could be explained, but it is a shift such that we don't see suffering in the same way as we did before. We have a much clearer understanding of how it can cease and what needs to be done for that. Whereas we tend to be wandering around a little bit and not sure exactly what that is until we see the cessation of it. We wander around only with an idea of what it's going to be like, but it ends. So the teaching on the Four Noble Truths, when it penetrates, gives a person that glimpse, and then you have a different reference point. And you have that reference point of actually having seen it end. And then the mind goes on in a different way, the different understanding about that. It's not the same as full awakening. To get that, you have to do those specialized practices with subjects like the aggregates or the sense bases. So it's yet a kind of a deeper penetration of how all of this is working. But we can get an initial glimpse that gives us a good reference point from which we can then go and do these other practices. At least that's kind of in the ideal sequence of how all this unfolds. There's always exceptions. So, so there's the gradual versus sudden that I touched into last time. I think one of the best resolutions of that I've heard is that it's gradual until it's sudden. And so there's preparation and the arising of certain wholesome qualities in someone's mind. And then there's the leading of the mind from something familiar into new territory that they haven't considered, like the Four Noble Truths. And then there can be some kind of a shift. So next time, I think, first of all, we should talk a little bit more about this quality of faith or confidence, because it might not be exactly what we think. And then also, we'll talk about an example of a path that starts with faith and ends with transformation that was given to both monastics and lay people. So it's a kind of another form of a standard stock teaching, but it's common to both, and it takes us through that same process. Yeah. So let me also then put into the chat a link that will take you to the Dhamma form for this class. Class is offered freely. I know we have one more session, but in case you were interested in knowing how to donate to the Sati Center or to the teacher, I've put a link in the chat that you can follow at your leisure. And I hope you'll come back for the ongoing discussion of this transformation that we go through, gradual, sudden, lay people, monastics. We know too much theoretically, it can hinder us, but I think it's also helpful to look at all the different ways it's expressed, many different ways it's expressed, and we're not even covering all of them in this short class. So I hope to see you next week, and have a wonderful week. Take care. Goodbye. Good night.